Okaeri! Welcome back to my channel, May Between the Pages. My name is Taylor, and today we're going to be doing my September wrap-up. September was just not it for me when it comes to reading. Not necessarily the quality of the books, but the quantity. So in my life right now, there's a lot of changes going on. I am changing my job, I am starting a new restaurant or company with my fiance, and I'm in the process of preparing for getting married here, as well as studying for a big Japanese exam that I have later this year. So there's just a lot going on that isn't book related, and in September it kind of all convalesced together, so I didn't have a lot of time even for audiobooks. Before we jump into the books I did read though, I do want to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion for the restaurant that I'm starting with my fiance. We live in Japan, so it is a restaurant in Fukuoka. However, even if you don't live here, follows and likes on social media, as we all know, really help get the word out. So it would mean a lot to me if those of you who are in this bookish community wouldn't mind giving us a follow on Instagram or on Twitter. I will be sure to link those two down below. The name of our restaurant is Tomiteba. In the beginning, we're going to focus on karage, which is fried chicken, and it's basically like a religion in Japan. And my fiance Hayato has a recipe, or multiple recipes, that he's perfected over the years of being a chef, and we're really happy to be able to share that with the world. We're also hoping to make a vegetarian option in the near future for those of you who prefer to have your fried tofu rather than your fried chicken. Okay, now that shameless self-promo is out of the way, let's get to the books that I did get to in September. There are only 3 of these. The first one is The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. If you've been around my channel for a while, I'm sure you've seen this mentioned because it's been on multiple TBRs before, but I finally got to it, and I'm really happy that I did. The Sword of Kaigen is about a main character named Misaki, who is a mother, and I love badass mother characters in fantasy. Yes. And she has a past of being able to fight, but she has currently settled down, I guess you could say, and kind of suppressed this part of herself to take the more traditional role of a wife and a mother. But war comes knocking on her doorstep, and it's the story of Misaki and the other characters in this book deciding what to do when their world is pretty much upended. This book is very obviously based on Japanese culture and Japanese, old school Japanese ways of life, and for the most part, that's really well done. I ended up giving this book 3 stars, maybe a 3.5, I haven't decided for sure, and that isn't a bad rating on my channel. 3 stars means that I enjoyed a book, but there were quite a few setbacks that I just couldn't overlook. Let me just start by saying the center of this book was a full 5-star read for me. The middle, like 250, 300 pages were just chef's kiss amazing. I have a vlog where I'm capturing how I feel while I'm reading this section of the book. I'll be sure to link it up above, but I was absolutely loving it. Emma Wang is amazing at writing fight scenes, and she's also really, really good on capitalizing on character work that she spent a lot of time building up earlier in the book. So in this center area of the book, which is where the climax is, which I think was an interesting narrative choice that I don't see very often, to have the climax in the middle, but this climax was done phenomenally. I felt so many feels, I cried more than once, and I realized how attached I was to these characters. The magic was also really well explained throughout the battle scenes, so it wasn't like you had some exposition about it and then got to see it in action. You kind of learned about it through the process of the battles, and that was a really, really enjoyable aspect of this book for me as well. I also loved the themes of showcasing and questioning the ideas of xenophobia and nationalism, since this community or this area this in the book is clearly based on Japan, and that is definitely a thing in real world Japan. So I liked that that was put kind of on the forefront for discussion, and it was discussed and questioned. I really enjoyed that that was in this book. However, this book comes down to a 3 stars for me for the beginning of the book and the end of the book. For me, this was a 5-star book, bookended by like a 2.5 star maybe. I'm a huge fantasy reader, so I am no stranger to the beginning of books kind of just throwing you into a world and you gotta figure out what's going on. I actually love discovering new worlds and kind of wondering, oh, what's this? I hope they explain it more later, and trying to figure out where things are, referencing maps to figure out, you know, how different countries relate to each other spatially. I love that beginning part of a fantasy book. So I don't have any problem with just throwing people in. However, the beginning of this book was so info-dumpy, I struggled. In order to understand the later plot points in this book, we had to understand the historical interactions between the different countries involved in this current war happening. So these are very important points to know and to learn as a reader. However, the way that it was done in the book was through a literal history lesson, where one of our characters is dazing out and not paying attention during the lesson, which I don't blame him for, because it was just immediately info dumped on us, who fought who and when and how, for a couple pages. And I found myself zoning out just like our main character. So, you know, that made me connect to him more, so that's a positive. But that was just not it for me. For me, it was the epitome of telling, not showing. Please show me that these things happened. Don't just tell me for 3 pages that they happened. Like I said, this information is important later in the book, so us getting this information definitely has a purpose, but the way that the information was given to us just did not work for me. I also mentioned that the end of the book was not my favorite, and I think that having a climax in the middle of the book is something that can work well, because I think there's a lot of value to seeing the aftermath of a battle and of a war, not just ending on that, you know, that final clash of, you know, two sides or whatever. I think that there is a lot of value in having a discussion about the aftermath and the effects of a big battle. You know, in fantasy, we tend to, you know, kind of brush off violence. We're pretty used to big battle scenes. And I think that there's a lot to be gained from having a discussion about what those battles can cause later. However, again, the application of this did not work for me in the Sword of Kaigen. It felt like it dragged on just way too much for me, and by the last 150 pages I was like, is this gonna wrap up soon? And it hurts me to say that, because the middle of the book I could not put it down. But by the end, yeah, I was just kind of like, okay, you know, we can wrap up the story now. There was also one character arc that I was really not a fan of. I think that it was the beginning of a redemption arc, and, you know, it's supposed to give us the idea that this character will continue to change going into the future, because as of right now, this is a standalone book, but I was not a fan of that. I think that, again, the way that the arc was handled was too quick, too fast. This character did a 180, and everyone around them was like, cool, I'm cool with that. And just did not make any logical sense for me. Finally, the last little critique that I have is the representation of the Japanese language in this book. I mentioned earlier that the representation of Japanese culture, you know, questioning the idea of xenophobia and, you know, nationalism, that I really liked that aspect, and that was consistent throughout the book. But the Japanese language aspect of this book continuously pulled me out of the story. In this book, it's written in English, obviously, but you can safely assume that all of the characters have been speaking Japanese to each other the whole time. It's just written in English for the reader. But randomly, there would just be a Japanese word thrown in there, like, I think I said this in my vlog, but the characters would say, you know, when they're thinking, continuously. but then randomly there would just be this one word, Japanese word, ano, which is what Japanese people say when they're thinking instead of and randomly a character would just say ano, and when I read that it would just pull me out of the story, like why the sudden switch, I guess. There were also points near the end of the story where Wang just switched to Japanese completely in a situation where there was some translation going on. So another character doesn't understand the Japanese, so the other two characters, when they're speaking to each other, Wang specifically wrote it in Japanese in the book. And in those moments, like the two characters talking to each other are a wife and a husband, and the language used is just really not natural for the context. The Japanese was grammatically correct. I'm not saying that, Wang messed up the Japanese in that regard, but Japanese is a very contextual language, and you use different words depending on who you're speaking to and the environment you're in, and the context was just not right. And that whole scene was ruined for me because I was just so distracted by that aspect of the book, and I don't think the book needed that. We've been reading it in English and been assuming, that the characters are speaking to each other in Japanese, so just leave it at that, Leave the Japanese influences, cultural influences, which were well done in there, and just, skip adding the language in there. But this was a problem for me because I speak Japanese. So if you don't, I really don't think this will be a problem for you in the book, so that was just kind of a me thing, I think. To conclude this 15-minute, talk about one book, I'll just say that I did enjoy reading this book. People were definitely right to recommend it to me, and I can see why people love it so much, especially as a self-published book. I would definitely recommend it, especially if you want to get your heart broken, but in a really good way. The next book I read in September was Redwall. This was a buddy read that I was hosting with JJ over on The Bearded Bookworm. If you've been around my channel, I'm sure you've seen me mention this. I will be sure to link him in the description down below. Please go check him out. We decided to do a read-along for this because both JJ and I read it as a child, and with fall coming up, or at least I, wanted a really cozy read to just kind of, wrap myself in. And I have really, really fond memories of Redwall. I didn't remember details of this series at all, but I remembered my obsession was this when I was young. And so I really wanted to see how I would think about it as an adult. As you can see, I really tabbed this book up to track my thoughts, and I have to say that I really enjoyed it on a reread. We also did a live stream, including people from the Discord that we have discussing this, which I will be sure to put a card up above and a link down below, where we go into kind of more in-depth thoughts about this, a little bit of spoilery thoughts. But just to give you a brief overview here. But just to give you a brief overview here, this is the first in a very long series about woodland creatures who live in an abbey called Redwall. The main characters are mostly mice, but later in the series, Brian Jacks does expand to other woodland creatures or other species. But in this first book, the main character is Matthias here, and he's just kind of living his own peaceful life at the abbey, doing his own thing. And then this big sea rat, Clooney the Scourge, comes to Redwall and decides he wants it for himself. So this story is about Matthias and the other creatures who live in the surrounding woods called Mossflower, and those who live in the abbey kind of banding together in order to fend off this evil sea rat. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. It was really enjoyable to go back into this world as an adult. I do have 2 main criticisms, however. The first one is that the characters are very archetypal, like to the point where there are no surprises. Based on the species of a character, you can tell what their personality is going to be like. So the rats and the ferrets and the weasels are evil, and the foxes are sly and also quite evil. And then the mice and the otters and the groundhogs, there's no groundhogs, what are they called? Moles. and the badgers, they're all, good. And so when you see a character introduced, at least in this first installment, there really are no surprises because you can imagine what role they're going to fulfill. However, within those roles, I think Jax does a really good job of making you really care for the characters, even the villains, which I'll get to. My second critique of this book was that the size of things just doesn't make sense. In the very beginning of this book, like the first couple pages, Jax mentions that Clooney comes into this world on like a horse cart. But then after that, Jax just abandons mentioning humans ever. And I can see why, because this scale he's kind of set up here already is struggling. And then if you add humans into it, God forbid a human found Redwall, like it would just be like a gingerbread house for them. I don't know. I think you made the right choice, not involving humans later. But there's one point where there's a badger, a big badger, and she's being held down by lots of rats, and the way that they're holding her down just wouldn't work with the relative size of a badger and rats. There's also a couple times with weapons that just don't make sense. So, I think that's me coming from an adult fantasy perspective and like projecting that onto a kid's middle grade fantasy from many, many years ago. But it was something that pulled me out of the story more than once. Like, that doesn't work. Despite those two criticisms though, overall, I had a really, really positive experience with this book. The characters' friendships in this book are so pure and beautiful, and they just make your heart happy, and you feel like you are part of this friend group. And you feel like you're part of this friend group when you're reading it. I also loved how different species had to come together and pool their different strengths in order to defeat Clooney the Scourge. They all had to come together to pool their knowledge and their resources in order to achieve a common goal, and I think that that is a great message for kids. So finally, I want to talk about the villains. So I said that Jax, while he does have archetypal characters, he makes you care about those characters. When it comes to those who live in Redwall Abbey, you care about them, like wanting them to succeed. But when it comes to the villains, like, I don't know if it's because I'm just reading softer middle grade recently, but like when I read this book was violent, and the bad characters like Clooney and his henchmen were terrifying, and they were violent. Even, the Redwall creatures in response were violent. There were moments of boiling people alive. There were moments of like slow strangulation witnessed by a child. Like, it was not middle grade level violence in my opinion. I mean, there weren't like blood and gore and guts. It wasn't anywhere on the lines of like the Poppy War or, Jade City or, just look behind me, Lies of Loch Lamora. It was nothing like that. But it was still like, wow, I read this as a kid, like, damn. I lied, there's a final point. And that is that the food descriptions in this book and in the continuing series, I remember, are fire. They are so good. Like, whenever the animals in Redwall have a feast, I become hungry because the food descriptions are mouth-wateringly good. Actually, someone in the Discord shared that there's like a Twitter account, a Twitter bot that automatically generates different food descriptions from throughout the series, and best believe I followed that because it's just a joy to read. Overall, I would highly recommend this for someone who wants a more cozy, just kind of pure at heart, despite boiling people alive story. And I think that it's definitely appropriate for its age group, because I read this as a kid and I didn't have any issues with, the violence that I mentioned. And I think it's just me as an adult looking back on it and being shocked. But as a kid, I don't remember at all feeling like traumatized by that aspect of this book. So I do think that if you have kids who are middle grade age, this is a really, really good series so far. Because those of us in the Discord enjoyed this so much, we are going to be reading one book from this series in publication order every other month. So if you're interested in joining us, I'll leave the Discord link down below. Please come join us and learn about some of the creatures from Mossflower and Redwall. I only read 3 books this month, and somehow this wrap-up is as long as my normal wrap-ups with 7 or 8 books, so we're gonna try to wrap this up quickly. The third book that I read was Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. So I read this book as part of my Retro Reads BookTube challenge that I have on my channel. Again, I'll put a card and a link down below. Every month I pull a title out of this cup that I have on my shelf, and in this cup I have put in, I think it's 15 titles from over 5 years ago, I believe, that were really well beloved on BookTube. Since I started BookTube pretty late into my life and pretty late into the life of BookTube, I wanted to see how I felt about books that were heavy hitters, you know, back in the day in this community. So I pick one book every month, and one of the books was Red Queen, and I picked it for September. Now, I know that this book was either loved or just hated, despised, like Twilight level despised when it came out. And I think a lot of that criticism was due to the fact that people said it was a combination of all the other big heavy hitters at the time. So it was basically like The Hunger Games and Divergent and all those types of books kind of merged into one, and all the tropes were there. Now, I definitely understand this criticism. There were no surprises in this book for me, but it wasn't as bad as I expected. Maybe because I went into it with lower expectations, it was able to, you know, exceed those expectations, but honestly, I didn't hate it. I think I ended up giving this book a 2.5 star. I should check my Goodreads. Yes, I ended up giving it a 2.5 stars, which is a 2 stars on Goodreads. A 2-star book for me is either one that there were a lot of things I really didn't like about it, or it was just completely unmemorable, and that's basically what Red Queen was. I've already forgotten some of the main plot points, so I think it was just the fact that it wasn't that memorable. I didn't hate it when I was reading it, though. There were a couple scenes that just made me roll my eyes, like, you know, the characters have different powers, and those who can read minds are called Telkies, and then those who can, you know, make plants grow, can you guess what they're called? Greenies. Like, come on now, just use a couple more brain cells with things like that. But when it came to the actual plot, I didn't hate it, and I did kind of like the ending where the characters ended up in the end. So yeah, I mean, it was a fluff read, and maybe if I just want something like an audiobook to just kind of blow through, and I have a lot of stress in my life and can't handle stuff, maybe I'll pick up later ones in the series, but not a priority. Concludes my September wrap-up. Sorry that it's so long, even though I read so little, but apparently I had a lot to say. I'm looking forward to doing a couple different readathons in October, and I really want to ramp up my reading if possible. I'm still in the process of doing a lot of life changes, so we'll see, but I'm sure my TBR will be up soon, and we all know I can't control myself. My TBRs are ridiculous. I think my TBR for September was like 9 or 10 books. I just like making the videos, apparently. Leave a comment down below if you've read any of these books. If you agree with my commentaries, if you disagree with them, I welcome, you know, debates in the comments if you've got some things to say. Also, if you want to join us for the Redwall Readalong for the next, you know, however long it takes us, please feel free to join us. But for now, I'm gonna head out. Jenny.